Folks, welcome to Culver City, California. It's been a high time. I've been bouncing around to a few different locations, but I finally found the right coffee bean. Ndugu, Chancler, what an honor, man. Welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Well, thank you, sir. Glad to be here finally in person.
Well, I have to tell you, I interviewed Mtume since the last time we talked. I've done two interviews with Mtume. All right, tracked him down. And I didn't realize this, but you guys connected way back when. Were you part of the US organization with him?
I wasn't part of the US organization, but I was around all those guys.
Do you want? Can you talk? Talk about.
I was in high school when he and I met and started playing. And he's just a little slightly older. He's like 4 years older than me. So he was part of the US organization. I was around the peripherals because during that time you had choices. You had the Panthers, you had the US organization, you had the Mau Mau's, you had SNCC, and of course you had the Muslims. So at that early age, I didn't commit to any of it. I just kind of snatched and grabbed, essences of things from all of them. I had the pleasure actually of meeting Elijah Muhammad in the barbershop, in my local barbershop, because he came in putting up posters and talking about Muhammad Speaks and all of that. So when you can connect with those great leaders, sometimes it's just what they touch you with means more than you just committing to one or the other.
Can you talk about how important it was at that time for you guys? You guys were searching for your roots. I know you were younger than Mtume, but he was really passionate about, and he still is, about connecting to the roots of the motherland, and you kept your options open. Can you just talk about why you still believe that the connection to your roots is the most important thing, if it is?
Well, you've heard the old proverb, if you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going. When it comes to this music that we play, the roots are deep-seated, not just musically, but historically, politically, economically, and socially, in the roots of Africa. I mean, when you talk about the slave trade, you talk about the music. When you talk about the religions, it ties into the music. When you talk about the different geographical locations in Africa and the rhythms and the drums and the music of those places, you're dealing with the roots of the culture and the people. The interesting thing about living and growing up in the United States is that African culture, even though it's deep-seated and rooted here in the United States, there are two other factions that play into that. And those two factions is the Native American culture, which is also part of that Afrocentric diaspora, and also the migration of the African slave going through the West Indies and Brazil and all of the other islands and Puerto Rico and all of those other places. So when you deal with all of that, the more you know about that, the more you understand and appreciate that we're all part of the same whole, and that the music relates to us in totality and not segmented. It's not just American music. It's not just Cuban music where it's divided. It's all from the same tree trunk of that African diaspora that has migrated across the globe.
Talking to Ndugu, Chancler here on the Jake Feinberg Show. Your family is Creole French, right? There's a Creole component to your family going from. How did they get? Can you talk a little bit about how they came to the West Coast?
How did we get to the West Coast is real simple, and it's funny.
Which part of the diaspora did your family come from? What was the closest thing to it?
Well, my father was more like Louisiana French Creole. That was his roots. We pronounce it Chancler, but it's really Chancler because it's French. but because of the colloquialism in Louisiana, it became Chancler. But our story of how we got here is the age-old black slave story. My father was ran out of Louisiana because he was successful and had his own business. The white man didn't like that. So my father got in a little trouble and they were looking for him. So he disappeared and moved out here and sent for us later. Wow. 3 months later, we came out. That's how it happened. I mean, that's the short story of it.
That's pretty heavy stuff. Going back for a minute, you're currently teaching at USC. How much of your practice, I mean, again, you're a master drummer and you can teach all the feel, you can teach the techniques and the style. How much do you teach about the history of diaspora to the students, what you just riffed on earlier?
Well, the first thing is, unless you really understand that music is a direct reflection of the social, political, economic time period for wherever you're located, you can't get to the music.
Dig.
You know, if you don't understand that, you can't get to the music. So in order to get to the music, you got to deal with the climate of what was going on at that particular time. You got to deal with politically what's going on, economically what's going on. I mean, even when we talk about the Great Depression, we talk about more musicians being employed than ever in the history of this country. Why is that? Because music was cheap and people could kind of drown their sorrows in the music.
Wash away that dust.
Right. You know, you stand in the suit line all day and then, you know, okay, well, what are we doing this evening? Well, we're going to hear a big band. You know, so you got all of these musicians working. So in understanding that there's a serious historical, social, economic, political component to the music, unless you understand that, you don't understand the music. And what's happening? It's just like when we talk about the music of the 60s and early 70s, the revolutionary music, the real, what they call black music, the struggling music, you know, the music of the revolution. You have to understand what was going on at that time. You got to understand, you know, the bombings of the churches. You got to understand the hosing down of the protesters and demonstrators and the dogs being put on them, and the music being a direct reflection of the composers airing out their grievances through the music, whether it be lyrically or melodically.
Mike Knock, I had a chance to interview him, and he, you know, obviously from Australia, but when he came to the States, he said that within the African American community, the music represented something completely different. Has music changed culturally? Has it made it harder for people to connect? Because, like you said, music is meant to, it's about feel, it's about feeling good. But now it seems to me, music is now made for pacification rather than burning. And I just wonder about your job as a professor and also somebody who's trying to communicate the societal and cultural components of it, because music doesn't have the same cultural meaning that it used to. But I just want you to riff on that.
Well, what's happening now is music, all through time, music has served different purposes.
Can you give some historical perspective, like different time?
I mean, you know, in let's start with the biblical time. The music was there for different ceremonial events. As we move through history, we moved beyond ceremonial events and got into protests. We got into entertainment. We got into dance. We got into all of these different diversions of the music, and in a lot of places we've lost the purpose of the music by the creators of the music. we've lost the purpose of that. And then there became music that was solely created to divert you from the reality.
The bottom line, right?
Yeah.
It's become about the bottom line.
Right. Right. So we had music that was created so you didn't have to think. So you could rest your brain and do your work and so forth.
Right.
The music,
right.
you didn't even have to
all I
think.
listen to is you playing the most burning music. And when I play it for people, they say, "Please turn this off. I can't listen to this," because their ears have. There's just something ferocious. But this is so important. In our first interview way back in 2011, when I first started my show, you said something so prophetic, and I want you to talk. You said, "I didn't ever want to be a starving genius." Okay, you advocated and always got paid. Can you talk about some people, some starving geniuses that you played with that you didn't want to eventually become?
That I didn't want to.
You didn't want to become that. You didn't want to be a starving genius.
Well,
it was the jazz life in some ways, but I know that you were like, I asked you about getting paid, about being considered a professional. You said, I never had a problem with that, because I didn't want to be a starving genius.
Art.
I know you play with Monk and those cats too. You know?
Art and music and the blues. I'm gonna lump the blues in there because those three variables, everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people think that you have to starve to have your heart and soul immersed in being artistic, creative, or to have the blues.
Yeah.
And my theory has never been based on that as much as when you look at everything in life, there's a light side, there's a dark side, there's a yin side, there's a yang side, there's a positive, there's a negative. And they both thrive and feed off of each other. So the negative side is, well, when you're starving and you're hungry, you create things a certain way. But the positive side is when you're comfortable and you're not starving, you create things a whole nother way. So that's like the good and the bad side of creativity. That's the good and the bad side of artistic growth and so forth. So for me, because everyone was always saying, you can't be a musician and make a living, why can't you make a living being creative and artistic if people really dig it and support it? The key, however, is finding your niche, finding your audience, and playing to that, acknowledging that, and always staying true to that. Once you're true to that, you know, they always say, follow your heart, follow your passion, the money will come. Well, if you got in it for the commitment of the soul of the music or the soul of the art, money's coming.
Just an enlightening conversation already with Ndugu Chancler here. I do want you to talk about Tommy. I had a chance to interview Tom Costner, and he spoke glowingly of you. But he also talked about how you guys used to collaborate together, and you always used to work on a feel. It could be a Latin feel, it could be a funk feel, but you actually created tunes on the road with Santana. Now, I just want you to talk to younger peeps out there about that organic process of creation, because Tommy said you guys were just having a ball doing it, and it didn't take a lot of effort. It was just more about picking out a feel. Obviously, you're a rhythm master, so it was hard not to feel the groove. But I wanted you to talk about that because he was riffing on that. It was kind of inspiring when he said that.
Well, you know, collaborations musically have to have a certain amount of natural instinctive matching. First off, you got to trust your partner because it's team play. The second thing is you got to both be somewhat or a great deal on the same page in direction, in goals and desires. It's hard to collaborate if someone is thinking contriving and the other one is thinking creatively.
Right.
So for Tom and I, being that we had a goal in mind, a common goal, and that was to see Carlos Santana come back to some of the roots that made him and made that band and pioneered that sound and that whole direction in music. We had to start off by pulling from those things. And the roots of those things were raw rhythm and basic melodic content. So for Tom and I, being on the road and playing all the things that we were playing with Carlos at that time, because at that time we were a jazz band, we were a funk band, we were a rock band, we were a Latin band, we were an R&B band, we had all of this stuff going. But it wasn't really expressed in the recordings where it made sense.
Yeah.
And you did like the Beatles did and took your audience with you on that trip. So they matured and growed with you. So Tom and I had this common desire that we can retain the basic elements of what makes up the Santana Band and bring that back to the forefront in today's times.
Profound. People are loving this interview, by the way. I'm having a ball with Ndugu. Could you talk about, when I listen to the stuff that you did with Hampton Hawes, when I interviewed Chuck Rainey, he's like, that's not the kind of music I necessarily like to play. I'm talking about Universe and Blues for Walls. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the first experience you had, if that was the first experience you had breaking up time and breaking up form. That is some of the, if not, what was the earliest experience you had doing that as a drummer, and whether that was something that you led with as a drummer, breaking up time, breaking up form. That stuff is about as abstract as you can get, and I don't think you guys, there was nothing written down, I don't think. I don't know.
Well, and I don't know if you've explored this with Mtume or with some of the other artists you've interviewed, but one thing about the whole revolutionary period was we paid a lot of credence and high regard to avant-garde jazz. And that was really the epitome of your arrival as a creative entity in being free.
Why? Why was it your arrival?
Because then your speech was based on whatever you were feeling at the time with whomever you were with.
Truth on the bandstand in the moment.
And it was that magical spontaneity that creatively sparked so many greater essences of musical direction during that time period, because we had no holds barred. And because there were instruments being created that people were experimenting with, electric piano and electric bass and synthesizers and different rhythm.
I heard Phil was bringing the Brazilian percussion into continue.
You're bringing all of this stuff in, but at the same time, you're trying to figure out how are you going to make this work. And there's no rules. There's no one telling you how it can work, what wouldn't work. It was an open field for people assimilating whatever they wanted to assimilate at the time.
How much of it had to do with the fact that the record labels as the primary medium, basically the bean counters were not involved with the creative. Nobody was telling Hampton Hawes, he was an artist, and that stuff got pressed. So that stuff got out into the ethos. It may not have gotten radio play, but it got pressed because it wasn't a bottom line thing. It's like, Oren Keepnews, make the record.
Well, you got to understand now, during this period, there was a serious underground. And when I say underground, the cultural backdrop of a lot of this music was underground.
Yeah.
Cult, following, so to
Subculture.
speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
You had it going in rock and roll at the same time, but at the same time you had it going in rock and roll, you had those guys pairing off with the jazz as well. So the essence of both of those musics were experimental, was cult followings, and was being done underground. Because at that point, you didn't have the venues of presentation that you had in the years to come.
Right.
You know, yeah, of course, Miles Davis had done Carnegie Hall, but you didn't have a lot of that. It was still underground music, so to speak. It was still done in various cultural places and events. So with that in mind, your following was based on them really being into what you were doing. No matter who you were, what you were doing. For me, having done a lot of that avant-garde music and paying respects to that music early on in my career, one of the greatest influences on me playing freely was Alice Coltrane. Because I worked with her in like 71, 72, going into 73. And Alice taught me so much, not just about music, but about life, about spirituality, about family, about innovation, about following your heart, about being a lead person and stepping out there on your own musical faith. You know, we don't talk about you stepping out there on your own musical faith enough, which is what really makes a great musician. What makes someone create their sound is them having faith in what they're doing, having belief in what they're doing, not necessarily comparing it to what someone else is doing, but someone saying, I feel this, I believe this. And I look at my playing, and because I've always had this heavy regard for the backdrop of Africa and African rhythms and African roots in my playing, I've always stepped out on the faith of that to propel me into what my playing became. So, also during that period.
Can you just tell me, can you give a specific Alice Coltrane story for the audience that was inspiring? Because, I mean, John had passed at that point. Can you talk about her leadership or just something that you gleaned from her specifically?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the most touching times for me with Alice Coltrane, and the most, for lack of a better word, the most revealing that we were doing the right thing was at the Auditorium Theater in Chicago, Illinois. One winter night, we opened for Sun Ra. The joint was packed. It's a 2,000-seat hall. Now, there weren't a lot of jazz artists doing those kind of venues then. The people had a chance to see avant-garde music with musical theater because Sun Ra